To read a bit more about social linguistics, and I started collaborating with social scientists and social linguists. But my background is computer science. So today I'd like to give a bit of an intro into this kind of emerging area of computational social linguistics. And then I want to highlight, I think, a particular direction that I think would be that I'm very interested in for the next few years. And feel free to just interrupt me or ask me questions during the talk. I think that would be nice to have a bit of interaction. So if something is not clear, just let me know. Right, so I think this is a very mixed background, and based on what I hear, I think all of you probably know what we mean with variation. These are just some slides that I often show when I talk to NLP people, for example, right? But I'm particularly interested in variation in text, and so there are many different ways to, let's say, write the same thing, right? So we can have lexical variation. I'm going to take the elevator, or I'm going to take the lift. Morphosyntactic variation, I gave the ball to her, or I gave her the ball. All kinds of other types of variation, spelling variation, which we see a lot in, for example, social media. So we could have something like, how are you doing? Or G-dropping in written form, how are you doing? Or even something like this, right? And so in natural language processing, if you look at the type of research that's done, then, well, first of all, NLP, at least the academic field, really focuses on English. But if we take a more careful look, actually, we see that NLP really focuses on standard English, right? And so language variation is often seen as noise. So if we look at papers, people often talk about like noisy social media text, for example, and variation is something that needs to be overcome. That's kind of the general view, like variation makes NLP tools work less well, and it's kind of a problem that needs to be solved. That's kind of how many people look at it, but I think there's certainly more toward to variation that people should consider. So I listed here, I think, 3 papers that are quite nice, that take a critical look on NLP and ideologies and looking at variation a bit. So if that's of interest to you, then these papers that I list on the slide might be relevant. But variation is inherently linked to the fact that language is a social practice, right? So that's what I'm also very interested in. So, for example, the way the person speaks or the way that someone writes is linked to all kinds of social attributes like age or the region where someone is from, socioeconomic class, etc. And so variation is not only noise, but it also carries a very important and rich social information. So social linguistics studies this relation broadly between language and society. And computational social linguistics, I think it's hard to give a definite definition, but it's kind of using computational methods to analyze or model this relation between language and society. With the emergence of social media and all the data that has become available, I think there's been really an interest in kind of computational social linguistics. I wrote a survey article on this in 2016 with a few other authors. It's quite outdated by now, but still, I think it could be a nice read if you want to get into the topic. But that's been happening a lot after 2016. So here are just a couple of topics that people work on, right? And that at least I see as computational social linguistics, but it's nowhere near of a full overview. So there's a lot of work on improving and testing the robustness of NLP models. So what people have observed is that NLP models tend to work differently across different demographic groups. For example, they work less well on text written by younger authors, or they work less well on text written in African American English, for example. So there's a lot of work on kind of testing these models as well as improving them. There's also a large body of work on using computational analysis to study all kinds of social linguistics or social linguistic phenomena like linguistic accommodation, audience design, geographical variation, etc. So here the idea is that can we really take a look at some interesting social linguistic questions, let's say revisit particular theories or test them using these computational methods. There's also a large body of work on trying to integrate social factors into NLP models to make NLP models work better, to generate better text, to improve natural language understanding. And there's also a lot of work on NLP for multilingual communication, for example, text that contains code phishing, etc. Right, so this is just a couple of directions, although there are many other topics that I've not listed here. So what I want to talk about today is I want to give one example.
You want to have some kanji?
Using NLP for analysis tools for social linguistics, social linguists and social scientists. And then large part of my talk will be on kind of testing NLP models, on checking to what extent they encode variation. And during my talk, I will highlight the different challenges as well. So feel free to interrupt me if you like to know more. But before I'll actually go into these topics, I want to quickly summarize something, kind of a technique in natural language processing that's really important nowadays, which are representations or vector representations. I think most of you or many of you might have seen it already, but just to make sure, right? So in natural language processing, at least in most modern systems, one important step is representing words, sentences, and other units like documents as vectors. So vectors are just list of numbers, right? So here, for example, A and B are two-dimensional vectors because both of them contain two elements. And we can plot these vectors in a space, a high-dimensional space. So for example, here, if A and B are two-dimensional vectors, we could plot them in or we can see them as points in this two-dimensional vector space. So for example, a word like cat could be represented as a vector, as a list of numbers. And the idea is that, for example, words that have similar meanings are closer to each other in this vector space. And the key thing is that these vectors are not created manually, but they are learned from the data. So what these natural language processing models do is they look at the context in which, for example, the words are used to learn these vector representations. So for example, for a word like cat, the model would look at all sentences in which the word cat occurs and its neighboring words. And in this way, it would learn a vector that somehow represents the meaning of the word cat. And so this is based on the distribution hypothesis that words that occur in similar contexts tend to have similar meanings. So this is a typical pipeline. We have some kind of data set like Wikipedia, books, Twitter. We give it to this embedding algorithm, and then the output would be for words, vector representations, or for documents, or for sentences. And these vector representations are really used across NLP at the moment. They are really important in neural networks. So for example, for text classification, sequence tagging, etc. But they're also increasingly used as research objects. So I want to quickly talk about this because the next studies that will highlight, they will use these vector representations. So are there any questions about this part?
Yes, maybe I have a question. I so far thought it would be only words that are represented as vectors, but you just said it's also sentences?
So initially it started with words, but nowadays it's sentences, documents, all kinds of different levels.
And how is it decided then, or how is it sentence defined? I mean, maybe this is too detailed, but just a rough idea.
A very simple approach would be, if you have a sentence, just take the average of their embeddings for each word.
Just take what? Sorry?
The average.
The average.
That's like a simple way, but more modern systems, what they, for example, do is instead of looking at the context of individual words, what they, for example, are trying to do is, given a sentence, predict whether next sentence is following that sentence or not. So they give the model different tasks, but in this way they can also force the model to learn some representation for the sentence.
Okay, interesting. Yeah, thank you.
Thanks for the question. Are there any other questions? Okay, so now I want to talk about new analysis tools, because I think one big advantage of using NLP for, let's say, social linguistics research is that I think it offers really interesting opportunities to look at certain questions that might be difficult without these computational tools. And this is an example of semantic change, which was mentioned in the introduction. So why? Well, first of all, I think we have lots of interesting data nowadays, right? We can think of online data, but also digitized books, all kinds of other types of data. And generally, this data is just too big to manually inspect, right? But I also think this data, for example, online data, can really complement these other sources that linguists or social linguists typically tend to work with, like survey data or something else, because people don't really know that they're being observed or that they are participating in experiments. So I think this data is potentially very interesting, but often just too big to manually inspect. Also, there are certain phenomena that I think we're interested in that are just really hard to quantify manually. For example, semantic change, and I'll talk about it in the next slide. And by using computational methods, we can sometimes find, let's say, interesting cases that might not match our expectations, right? So computational models can identify cases that kind of defy certain patterns or that are outliers or something else. And these could be interesting cases for manual inspection. So here's one illustration. So this was a study where we looked at semantic change. And basically the idea is, can we find words that have changed meaning over time? Or perhaps even say, well, can we really track how words and how are changing over time and how much on a very fine-grained scale? And I think this is something that would be really difficult to try to do this manually, right? And so here is one way to do this using these vector web stations. And this is not something that we came up with. This idea has been around for a while, that if you have these vector web stations where, in this case, we're just looking at words, each point in the vector space represents a word. And now if we have, let's say, two different time periods, period 1 and period 2, we can compare the positions of these web stations for the individual words and see whether they have shifted during these time periods. So, for example, for a word like broadcast, in period 1, if it's, well, the position there on the left, and then if we look at period 2, and that particular word has really moved to a different place in the vector space, that indicates that the meaning or the usage of that word has really changed between these two time periods. Right. And so the study has been done by many different people, but I think what we did was slightly differently is that we really looked at change on a very fine-grained scale. So we looked at Twitter data where we really were looking at month-by-month changes. So here's an example. For each word, we were measuring how much it had changed over 5.5 years. And then we identified words that had changed the most. So one word that came up was the word vine, which can refer to something like the grapevine, but also in January 2013, Vine was this video hosting service that got launched in 2013. So the red graph, the red line in this figure shows you the frequency of the word vine. The blue line shows you the message semantic change, where change is compared to the very first time period. And the green line indicates the biggest point of change as identified by the methods. And you see actually that this point of change that was identified matches the introduction of this video hosting service quite well. Here's another example. Another word that was identified by our system is the word glow. Glow had many different meanings, but then in August 2013, rapper Chief Keef, he released this video, Gotta Glow Up One Day. And Glow acquired this new meaning of an impressive personal transformation, for example, in style or demeanor. And so again, here we see that the biggest point of change around July 2013 matches the release of this video quite well, right? And so this just illustrates that we can now measure how words are changing over time on a very fine-grained scale. And you can imagine that social analysis could identify interesting words that we could take a look at qualitatively, or we could even do, let's say, a quantitative analysis where we incorporate social factors or linguistic factors to try to understand how words are changing. Yes, please go ahead. I see a question.
Yeah, I hope this isn't getting too technical for right now, but how did you train the embeddings to measure the change? So did you like train fresh embeddings for each slice, or did you yeah, basically?
That's a good question. So the question was, well, we train embeddings for each time period, right?
Mhm.
But if you have worked with embeddings, then you know that there's no guarantee that these dimensions match up, that the first dimension in period 1 corresponds with the first dimension in period 2. At least if you just use the standard word embedding algorithms. So we try different ways to, let's say, align them. So one way is to train embeddings independently for each month, but then use an alignment algorithm that kind of tries to align these different vector spaces. And once you have done this, you can use cosine and net in everything else, because then they're comparable. There are also more recent methods that train these embeddings over time continuously, and in this way guarantee that the dimensions are comparable across different time periods.
I'm wondering about the continuous training, because then don't you run into issues where you have just much smaller data sets for earlier time periods, and that will cause problems as well, won't it?
Yeah, actually, so in our case, we did evaluate these methods, and just training them independently and aligning them worked very well. The continuous methods are harder to train, and there are also all kinds of issues. So you're right. In practice, actually, I see still many people just training them independently and then aligning them. But I think these continuous methods also have interesting potential. Yeah. But definitely, the data across different time periods might not be the same. Vocabulary, right, might not be the same. There are all kinds of different issues. Yeah, that's another question.
Yeah, actually, I raised my hand, if I may.
Yeah, sure.
Okay, because usually semantic changes take time. Yeah. And the regular situation in historical linguistics is that even sometimes years and years, when a change started, we find both contexts used. Think of a word such as revolution in English. And now revolution means, you know, some movement, etc. But the original meaning that is connected with revolving and orbiting and things is still there. So of course, there are different frequencies and proportions, and but in both senses, it is attached to different categories. So actually, when you have identified broadcast, period 1 and period 2, it doesn't mean that broadcast in the sense of period 1 would not surface in a number of different type of texts. This is what I experienced too. And as to embeddings, yes, I've been using embeddings for offensive language identification, that is fast text and word2vec, and then hate bird. But then certain results of embeddings were not only surprising for us, but they were sometimes counterintuitive. So it's a great tool, but I think to use it, one needs some initial training or something of that kind. I wonder whether you found that too. Thank you.
Yeah, so thanks. These are some really good points. Yeah, so first of all, at least the method that I'm describing here just indicates some change. It doesn't say that a sense has completely taken over of another sense. It could be even just like, a word losing one of its senses or one sense becoming more popular or something. It just indicates that there is some change. But I think one of the main challenges indeed in applying these methods that it can be still difficult to interpret the results. So definitely, I think that's one of the key challenges that I think would need to be worked on to make this more usable. I forgot what you mentioned. Oh yeah, and in our results, and I'm not sure to what extent it aligns with your results, because we're looking at social media data. Of course, we find many words that have quote unquote changed, but it's mostly affected by particular events, right? Or even a word like Vine is not very interesting from a social linguistics point of view, right? Because it was a closing service.
Yeah, thanks a lot.
Yeah. We also applied exactly the same method to look at emojis. And so this is just one figure from the paper, where in this case the red line shows you the message semantic change and the blue line shows you the frequency. And so one emoji that popped up in our data was the skull emoji. And looking at the words close to the skull emoji in the vector space, we saw that the skull emoji was used in a mostly literal way in the beginning in 2012. So neighboring words were words like zombie, corpse, bury, etc. But then 2013 and onwards, it was used in a more figurative way, with words like LMAO, etc. Becoming close neighbors. So I'd like to highlight, I think, one big challenge that we came across while working on this problem is evaluation, because usually there are many different word embedding models that we could try, all kinds of different decisions that we can take, and how do you decide which one is good, right? So in natural language processing, what we like to do is to compare our models against something that's called the ground truth, let's say the answers that we expect. So for example, if you're interested in identifying words that have changed meaning over time, ideally you have some list of words identified by experts or something that have changed over time, and you want to check whether the method identifies these words. You can think of something similar with geographical variation. The problem is that typically these lists, and this is something that people have done in the past, are relatively small, and the words that are in these lists, they have changed so clearly that actually all models that we try will identify these words. So we're not able to do really fine-grained comparisons between these systems. And I think a more important issue is that if we really knew the answer to, let's say, this question that we're interested in, if for each word in our vocabulary we would know whether it changed or not, then we wouldn't need a system like this, right? So for these kind of analyses that are really about, I would say, generating new insights, we usually don't have a clear ground truth. We don't really already know the answer that we're actually interested in, right? And I think this really makes evaluation of these systems really difficult. So this is something that I often struggle with developing these kind of tools. We talk about it a little bit in this paper that I mentioned here, where we kind of reflect on challenges related to kind of this interdisciplinary research area. Now, what we did in this particular case, and also in another study where we looked at geographical variation, where we did exactly the same thing, right? How do we compare different models to identify geographical variation? How do we know which one of the models better? In the end, one of the things that we did, and I don't think this is perfect, is generating synthetic data, like simulating particular scenarios. For example, with semantic change, generating scenarios where we know there's semantic change, generating scenarios where there is some temporal pattern, but actually not semantic change, and then checking how these different methods perform on this type of data. And in this case, I think it's really crucial that there is some domain knowledge, or that you ideally collaborate with some expert to think about how to create such synthetic data. it's not ideal because synthetic data is always a simplification, but at least it allows you to systematically test these different methods according to different aspects. But if you have other talks about how to evaluate such kind of tools, I would be really interested, because this is something that I often struggle with working in this area. Yes, go ahead.
Sorry, will you say a bit more of about how you create synthetic data?
Sure. So for example, with semantic change, what we did was we had this large Twitter corpus. So we generated, we selected tweets, but what we actually did was we selected tweets from 1 month, and then we just duplicated this 1 month of tweets to simulate, let's say, 1 year of data, but actually each month is just the same. And then we artificially insert particular changes in the data. So we artificially replace particular words in the data to simulate the idea that one word acquired a new meaning. Or we artificially increase the frequency of particular words over time, which isn't a temporal trend, but actually isn't really semantic change. So we created different scenarios by changing the data and then testing whether these models then identify these changes or not.
Okay, but the kind of the degree of change was based on what? Like because in the Vine example, you have these peaks.
Yeah.
Did you also have peaks, or did you just say, okay, it will rise 20%, or?
Yeah, I mean, so that's a bit ad hoc, right? So we tried different numbers, right? And then you can also see to what extent how sensitive particular systems are. But of course, I think that's the limitation of synthetic data, that it's always a simplification. So what we had was, with a certain probability, a word might use this new meaning, and then this probability increases over time, right? And then can a system identify that particular word?
And then you compared this, what is like statistically to be expected, with what you saw in the real data?
No, so we had the synthetic data, and then let's say we had 10 different systems to measure semantic change, right? So different word embedding models,
okay.
different ways of aligning embedding spacers, etc. And then we checked which of these methods would identify the change that we had created in the data.
I see. Okay,
Yeah.
thanks.
Thanks. Because there are usually so many different decisions that you can take, and then how do you decide which one to use, right? So that was what we were struggling with this particular problem. Yeah. Any other questions? Great. Now I'll switch topics a little bit and talk about something that I'm quite interested in, and it's getting more interest in the community, but it's also very difficult. So when we're looking at representations, and there's really a large body of work on representations and NLP, I think a key question is what aspects of meaning should these representations capture, right? That's like how do you evaluate the quality of these representations? So for example, in literature, there's been all kinds of methods to check whether representations capture certain semantic and syntactic properties, like do these representations encode to the fact that the noun is plural or singular, for example, right? And we would expect that these representations, if they're good representations, they would capture all these important aspects of word meaning. More recently, there's been increasing attention towards this kind of social nature of language and how that might play a role in learning these representations. So I listed a few papers here that talked about this, but what I think is a bit of an underexplored perspective is this idea of social meaning evaluation. So often there are different ways of writing something, right? I gave examples in the beginning. So here we see 3 different spellings for the word doing. And I think a key question is, well, should all these different spellings of the word doing receive exactly the same vector representation? My view is that in many cases, we actually wouldn't want them to receive exactly the same representation, because then we would lose the kind of social information that is associated with the use of these particular forms. Right? So social meaning has been overlooked in developing representations. So why does this matter? Well, for example, if you look at conversational systems, right, you might want to have a conversational system that can adapt their style towards the conversation partner. Or in terms of computational social linguistics, you might be interested in questions related to language and society. And so then variation is meaningful, right? And we would actually want to also encode these in the representations. So if you're interested in this, I wrote a short article with Laura Rosil and Jack Reeve recently, kind of reflecting on this issue. So, of course, fully learning and representing the rich social meanings of linguistic variation is very difficult, would not be realized anytime soon, and might even be impossible, right? But even very small steps in this direction could, I think, already benefit NLP applications and possibly support new directions in social science research. What I think is really difficult, though, is that social linguistics has mostly focused on speech data if we look at literature. So sometimes it's very difficult to then translate particular findings in social linguistics to textual variation. This is something that I often struggle with, for example, if I want to evaluate particular NLP systems, then actually I can't find many articles looking at that specific type of variation, because many articles, they focus on variation in speech. Also, social meaning is highly contextual. So I think it would be really important for NLP models to take more social context into account, right? But how rich this context should be, I think is an open question, and also how to then evaluate such systems. So now I want to highlight two studies that are really first steps towards kind of this question of, can we encode variation or, you know, let's say social meaning or associations with particular social attributes in these representations. Now, I think given the amount of time, I think I will just go a little bit quicker over the first study and then discuss the second study in a bit more detail. So this is a study with Jack Reeve, where we're looking at word embeddings, and we wanted to check, do these word embeddings encode something about spelling variation? So if you remember, these embeddings, they are learned based on the context in which words occur. So in that sense, I think you would actually expect that they might actually encode something about variation, because we often see that particular forms of spelling variations are used in different contexts. Right? And so the motivation is that many spelling variants that we see online are actually not misspellings, right? By deviating from these conventional spelling norms, writers create social meaning. So that's why I think, depending on the application, it might also not be desirable to map all these spelling variants to exactly the same point in the embedding space, but we might want to encode something about variation in these representations as well. Right, so the question that we started off with is, well, do word embeddings can capture or encode spelling variation? We looked at two different data sets, the Twitter data set and a Reddit data set. And here's just one thing to illustrate. So these are word embeddings trained on Reddit data. So Reddit is this online platform. And this was trained using the skipgram word embedding algorithm. And the key thing of this algorithm is that it actually learns vector representations for words without looking at the spelling of words. So it just looks at the context in which the words are used. Still, if you look at all these different forms of nothing, I think you do see clear groups, right, of particular forms. So for example, lengthened forms are closer to each other. Here we see misspelled forms and the standard spelling are closer to each other. And here we see all kinds of dialectal spellings of nothing. And even within this larger cluster, we see a smaller cluster that is more similar. So this just suggests that, or indicates that there's certainly some structure in which these different spelling variants for nothing are used in the data, right? They're used in different contexts. And this is also reflected in their embeddings. And we want to test this in a more systematic way. So we looked at 7 different types of spelling variation, like lengthening, swapping of characters, G-dropping, etc. And what we did was we, using some heuristics, we created pairs, right, of what we call conventional and non-conventional forms, like, for example, the word and, with and without lengthening. And then we manually went over these pairs to filter the ones that were genuine cases of spelling variation, because there were also sometimes a little bit of noise, like, for example, this is a case where we disagreed or where we weren't sure, like planting and planting. Is this really a case of G-dropping, or is planting a misspelling of planting, for example, right? So that's why we manually went over these pairs to only keep pairs that we were really sure were cases of the spelling variation that we're interested in. Right, and so these were the types of spelling variations that we then tested in these models. And just to illustrate these patterns of the spelling variation in Reddit data, for example, if we look at G-dropping, we see that G-dropping is much more prevalent in subreddits. So these are kind of sub-communities on Reddit that are called like Teenagers New or Kanye. And there's a very low amount of G-dropping in subreddits called Legal Advice or Change My View. Or something like nearby character substitution, where a character is changed with a character nearby on the keyboard. We see that subreddits Teenagers New and Drugs have a higher occurrence of this type of variation than transcribers of Reddit or Tesla Motors. Right, so this is also just to illustrate that if we look at different subreddits, we also see, I think, patterns that make sense in terms of spelling variation. So we see these patterns in the data. Now, what happens if we then train word embeddings on this Reddit data, for example, right? Let me just looking at the time.
Can I ask something, Dawn?
Yes.
I think it's very interesting that you pick something like ing, because it's been such a massively discussed variable, right? And like I intuitively agree with you that what you found, the pattern makes sense, right? The only thing I would be a bit worried here is that that's just one level of in meaning, right? Because ing doesn't only kind of identify working class populations and so on, but it also identifies informal language use, right? So what you're finding here might just be that they are chatting, like, because they're in Reddit. So it's not, so I'm wondering, can we keep that apart, that this is not young people using Reddit, you know, not just young people's use, but young people in an informal context? Do you see what I mean?
Yeah, so
it has a stronger sense there, I think, the informal formal.
Yeah, so what I'm showing you here is just the different frequencies, let's say, in these different subreddits. But there are all kinds of different factors that could come into play, right? Like the amount of formal, informal language, or different user groups, right? I think there's a different population that's active in Teenagers New compared to Legal Advice. So we don't know, and we don't really.
Okay. I mean, I think it's interesting that you pick on a form like that, because there are certain ones when we're talking about English sound variation that is transcribable, that has been studied to death, really, across different English-speaking countries as well. So it'd be interesting to just even take that and say, okay, this is what they say. You know, what does this model produce now for social media contexts and stuff like that, you know? Could you give an example of what you were thinking of, like what type? Well, I mean, I specifically mean the ing variable, right? It's in the sociolinguistic world. This is, I mean, it just reminds me. I was talking to my second-year students about it the other day. And so the big thing that you know, there's all kinds of different factors that were also developed from a linguistic perspective and also from a social perspective, and that it's more prominent the differences are more prominent in the UK, but not so in other parts, for example. And, you know, we could actually take all of those and see how they map onto this, you know, onto the social media data, for example. Do you see what I mean?
Right,
so you
so
have actually kind of a ground, because you were talking about the ground. For that, you have a ground.
Right, so kind of looking at the literature and then checking particular findings.
Yeah, I mean,
sure.
yeah, for example, so that would be an interesting one, but I put that in the chat because it's my personal hobby horse. One of the big things, especially when we look at English research in sociolinguistics, is the fact that English-based variation in sociolinguistics is very heavy into sociophonetics, right? Yeah. So they actually act as if there's no other variation. And I think it has an ideological basis, right? So this is why you will find it difficult to find baseline data, because there's very little on lexical and syntactic variation. And if you do, it's for the Caribbean, right? And or for other outlying places, right? And so I wonder if shifting to another language would help, because a lot of continental languages have been studied much more on a lexical structural basis. If there is sociolinguistic work, I would say.
That's interesting. Yeah, I hadn't considered that.
Well, I mean, I'm just mentioning it because it's something that I'm hunting down for quite some time, you know. Yeah. So, you know, I'm wondering, but I do think this one, maybe also TD deletion. I mean, if you want to, we can talk about it at some other stage. There are some, and they are just coming back to me because I do teach this kind of stuff. And so people, it's still very big and keeps being restudied left, right, and center, you know.
Yeah, that's a very good point. So definitely, I think these are really good ideas. So, for example, for English and spelling variation, yeah. I'm currently collaborating with social linguists or variational linguist Laura Seal to actually just collect our own perception data related to spelling variation as a way to get some data.
So and I mean, and then there's also the different waves of sociolinguistic research. Wave 3 would possibly go a little bit the way you go, but I mean, there could be new ways in which this could be dealt with, like put together with perceptual and usage data. Yeah. Okay. Thanks.
Yeah. So this table is just to illustrate. So I think for you, it's clear that these spelling variants are not just randomly used in all kinds of different contexts. But this is just more to illustrate, okay, they're, you know, that just not distributed randomly, but there are certain places where particular forms are used more often than others. And so if we train a model on this data, then we might expect that the model would also learn something about G-chopping or character substitution, for example, because they tend to be used in different contexts. These were two embedding models that we tried. They're basically the same, except that fast text is taking character, the spelling of a word into account, and skipgram doesn't. Let me just illustrate like one finding that we had, and this is a really simple analysis. We had more analyses in the paper, where we just looked at how close are these variants in the vector space. And so what I thought was interesting is that forms like G-chopping, lengthening, and vowel omission, if we compare the vector representation of this non-conventional form, for example, a form that contains G-chopping, with the vector representation that of the standard form or the conventional form, then the similarity is quite low. So that's kind of what's highlighted here, compared to the other categories like swept characters, common misspellings, and keyboard substitutions. So one thing that I suspect, but it's really just a speculation, is that these forms are used in a more intentional way sometimes and tend to occur in a specific context. Well, for example, perhaps misspellings and also swept characters, they are more used in all kinds of different contexts, perhaps, and that's why their embeddings are, in this case, we kind of see this difference between these two different cases. What else? Yes?
Sorry, I didn't want to interrupt.
Oh, no, go ahead.
I was just wondering, because there was this kind of misspelling in the drug subreddit.
Yeah.
And I wondered, has the method been used by forensic linguistics to detect? Because I mean, of course, you also use misspellings to avoid being detected by, you know, we had that in Mandy Lau's presentation of like, you know, algorithmic automatic hate speech detection or criminal things. Wouldn't that be, is that something that is used here? And or would that, do you think that would make sense?
Actually, I don't know. I think it's a really interesting question. I think there's a lot of work looking at authorship attribution, etc., right, in forensics, where they use character sequences. So I can imagine that in this way they would also learn these type of patterns if that's useful. But I'm not too familiar with this area.
Yeah. Okay, thanks. Super interesting.
Can I maybe say one thing as well? Again, I think third wave sociolinguistics could be useful here, because what you could do is you could extract examples out of your data and then do kind of a qualitative analysis, right? And this is what they like doing. And I think it's been quite useful in the sense that you get the general patterns from the statistical part, and then you look into the reality of them by checking some, not all, you know, checking some, if there is a reality to it. And it's sometimes turned up quite surprising stuff, you know.
So I'm just looking at the time. So let me summarize the second study, kind of the key points. And then I think I'll just reflect on the final, give a little bit of reflection. So this is a more recent study where we were looking at kind of these modern NLP systems, and we wanted to test to what extent they can distinguish different styles of writing. Right, and so style is important for all kinds of different applications, like analysis of conversations, if you think of linguistic accommodation, but also natural language generation, etc. And well, if you look in the literature, there are so many different definitions of style. So what we did with this particular study is that we more provided a particular, let's say, framework, but depending on your specific definition of style, you might include or exclude particular test cases. So one key challenge that I want to highlight is that often style and content are certainly correlated, right? Like, for example, if you're in a pub with your friends, you talk in a different way, but you also talk about different topics than when you talk with your boss, right? And so that makes evaluating these kind of systems difficult, because what happened in the past is that people don't really control for content. And so if you then test your model and you have a high performance, then you're still not really sure if the model has learned to distinguish different styles or is just using content signals. So for example, if you give the model a document and say, can you classify whether this is informal or formal, and the document is about drinking a beer, right? The model might say, okay, this is informal, but has the model really learned to identify specific linguistic signals that relate to informal language, or is it just looking at the word beer, for example? So I just want to highlight kind of the test that we came up with, and perhaps if you're interested, then you can take a look at the paper about how exactly we created the data set. What we did was we generated the following test cases. So we have two sentence pairs, the anchor sentence pair and another sentence pair. And each pair contains two sentences that are paraphrases of each other. Right? So, for example, the anchor pair, are you a fan of them or something, or are you one of their fans? Oh, and also that young physician got an unflattering haircut, and oh yeah, and that young doctor got a bad haircut. And these are paraphrases, although if you look at the data, I think there are definitely cases where you could argue whether these are truly paraphrases or not, but generally they describe the same content. And then the task is to check whether the sentence 1 and sentence 2, if they match the style order of anchor 1 and anchor 2. So in this case, if you look at the anchor pair, the first sentence is more informal than the second sentence. The second sentence is more formal. So A2 is more formal than A1. And if you look at the bottom sentence pair, S1 is more formal than S2. And what we do is we ask these NLP models to check or give the answer to the question whether the style order of the anchor pairs match the style order of the sentence pairs. And because they are pair phrases, the model can't really use content signals like is it about beer or is it about something else, but it's really forced to look at the style in which something is written. We looked at different, let's say, dimensions or characteristics like formal, informal, simple, complex, text that contains number substitution, etc. Yeah, given the time, I'll just skip it, but if you're interested, then just take a look at the data. We at the paper we created a data set and tested different models. But yeah, you can take a look at the data if you want to know more. So let me just give you the final thought. So it's nice that actually the third wave of social linguistics was mentioned just before. So right, so in social linguistics there are these kind of three different waves. Where the first wave is about broad demographic categories and correlations. Second wave is social network information, local categories, and ethnographic methods. And the third wave is really about meaning making, right, and the agency of speakers. And if we look at work in natural language processing, then I think almost all the work really, to some extent, takes this first wave approach, looking at broad demographic categories, and not really looking at performance or taking speaker agency into account, but really just kind of categorizing people in particular bins. So that's really what a lot of studies in NLP do. But what I hope to see is that we move more towards not fully abandoning first wave, but also looking at kind of lessons that we can draw from second and third wave social linguistics by looking at social network information and also really how people use language to create, for example, social meaning, and how we could, to some extent, model that in our NLP models. So that's something that I hope we would move towards too. But of course, that's really difficult. But I hope that's something that I at least would be very interested in. And so the final words is at least that language variation, I think, is everywhere. It's not just noise, but it really allows us to better understand and analyze social phenomena. And therefore, I think it's also so important for natural language processing to really start thinking about variation.